Passing AZ-400 Designing and Implementing Microsoft DevOps Solutions exam meets part of the requirements for Microsoft Certified DevOps Engineer Expert Certification. Passcert provides the latest Microsoft DevOps Engineer AZ-400 dumps that will help you to pass the Microsoft AZ-400 exam with outstanding result in your first attempt. Questions 1. In Azure DevOps, you create Project 3. You need to meet the requirements of the project. What should you do first? A. From Azure DevOps, create a service endpoint. B. From SonarQube, obtain an authentication token. C. From Azure DevOps, modify the build definition. D. From SonarQube, create a project. Answer. A. Questions 2. You have a project in Azure DevOps. You plan to deploy a self-hosted agent by using an unattended configuration script. Which two values should you define in the configuration script? Each correct answer presents part of the solution. Note: each correct selection is worth 1 point. A. Authorization credentials. B. The project name. C. The deployment group name. D. The organization URL. E. The agent pool name. Answer. A. D. Questions 3. You need to meet the technical requirements for controlling access to Azure DevOps. What should you use? A. Azure Multi-Factor Authentication, MFA. B. On-premises firewall rules. C. Conditional access policies in Azure AD. D. Azure Role-Based Access Control, Azure RBAC. Answer. B. Questions 4. You are automating the build process for a Java-based application by using Azure DevOps. You need to add code coverage testing and publish the outcomes to the pipeline. What should you use? A. Cobertura. B. Bullseye coverage. C. MS Test. D. Coverlet. Answer. A. Questions 5. You are automating the build process for a Java-based application by using Azure DevOps. You need to add code coverage testing and publish the outcomes to the pipeline. What should you use? A. Cobertura. B. Bullseye coverage. C. MS Test. D. Coverlet. Answer. A. Question 6. Your company uses Azure DevOps for the build pipelines and deployment pipelines of Java-based projects. You need to recommend a strategy for managing technical debt. Which two actions should you include in the recommendation? Each correct answer presents part of the solution. Note: each correct selection is worth 1 point. A. Integrate Azure DevOps and SonarQube. B. Integrates Azure DevOps and Azure DevTest Labs. C. Configure post-deployment approvals in the deployment pipeline. D. Configure pre-deployment approvals in the deployment pipeline. Answer. AC. Question 7. You have an Azure DevOps organization named Contoso. You need to receive Microsoft Teams notifications when work items are updated. What should you do? A. From Azure DevOps, configure a service hook subscription. B. From Microsoft Teams, configure a connector. C. From the Microsoft Teams Admin Center, configure external access. D. From Microsoft Teams, add a channel. E. From Azure DevOps, install an extension. Answer: A. Questions 8. You have an Azure DevOps organization that contains a project named Project 1. You need to create a published wiki in Project 1. What should you do first? A. Modify the storage settings of Project 1. B. In Project 1, create an Azure DevOps pipeline. C. In Project 1, create an Azure DevOps repository. D. Modify the team configuration settings of Project 1. Answer: C. Questions 9. You have an Azure DevOps project that contains a release pipeline and a Git repository. When a new code revision is committed to the repository, a build and release is triggered. You need to ensure that release information for the pipeline is added automatically to the work items associated to the Git commit. What should you do? A. Modify the integrations options for the pipeline. B. Modify the post-deployment conditions for the last stage of the pipeline. C. Add an agentless job to the pipeline. D. Modify the service hooks for the project. Answer: B. Questions 10. You have an Azure DevOps organization named Contoso. You need to recommend an authentication mechanism that meets the following requirements. Supports authentication from Git. Minimizes the need to provide credentials during authentication. What should you recommend? A. Managed identities in Azure Active Directory, Azure AD. B. Personal Access Tokens, PATs, in Azure DevOps. C. User accounts in Azure Active Directory, Azure AD. D. Alternate credentials in Azure DevOps. Answer: B.